All right, my friends, we have 2 chapters left. I'm going to read them both today. Maybe I'll just upload them all onto YouTube tonight, and that way, if you want to keep going, you can, and then I could start Edward Tulane tomorrow. Okay, what happened about the statues? What an extraordinary place, cried Lucy. All those stone animals and people, too. It's like a museum. Hush, said Susan. Aslan is doing something. And he was, indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. What do you think that did? Hope you said brought it back to life. And then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and he breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you might remember, was standing a few feet away from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to the 2 centaurs. But at that moment Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect that you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper, which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, maybe in a fireplace. And for a second, nothing seems to have happened. But then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping across the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back, and then it spread, and then the color seemed to lick all over him, as the flame licks all over a bit of paper. Comparison. And then, while his hind quarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stony folds rippled into living hair. And then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a big yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life, and he lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisking around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum. It looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running around after Aslan and dancing around him until he was almost hidden. I don't know what that noise means. In a crowd. Oh, maybe it's an email. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors, glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, ruddy brown foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs. And the birch girls were all in silver. The beech girls were in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls were in a green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roars, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shoutings, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone. "Look, is it safe?" Lucy looked at Aslan and saw that he had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan had listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs, and now he was moving to his feet. A moment later he lifted his club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground?" "Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so at last he understood, then he bowed down until his head was no further off the top of the haystack, and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that I bet you've never seen a giant when his face is beaming. Beaming means smiling. It's a sight well worth looking at. Well worth looking at, meaning like you should take a look at it. "Now for the inside of this house," said Aslan. Look alive, everyone! Upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chambers. Leave no corner unsearched. You may never know where some poor prisoner may be hidden." Into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible old castle echoed with the opening of windows and with everyone's voices crying out all at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding staircase! Oh, I say! Here's a poor little kangaroo! Call Aslan! Phew! How it smells in here! Look out for trap doors! Up here! There's a whole lot more on the landing!" But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs and shouting, "Aslan! Aslan! I've found Mr. Tumnus! Come quick!" A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding one another by both hands and dancing around and around for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was, of course, very interested in all that Lucy had to tell him. But at last, the ransacking of the witch's house was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and light in the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had gotten in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan. And then, rising up on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hi, you up there!" he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin, if it please your honor," said the giant, once again touching his cap. That means hat. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor, it will be a pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns," and then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. Repetition. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them the sky. "Blowed if I ain't in a muck sweat," said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. Did you hear that? Puffing like the largest railway engine. "Comes of being out of condition. I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as pocket handkerchiefs about you?" "Yes, I do," said Lucy, standing on her tiptoes, holding a handkerchief up as far as she could reach. "Thank you, missy," said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. And the next moment Lucy got quite a fright, for she found herself caught in the mid-air between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started, and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up a little girl instead. I beg your pardon, missy. I thought you was the handkerchief." "No, no," said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." And this time he managed to get it. But it was only about the same size to him that a little pill would be to you. So that when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro against his red giant face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Not at all, not at all," said the giant. "Never have I met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," said the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clear, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was. But an old family. With traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she never would have turned him to stone." At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for everyone to be quiet. "Our day's work is not over yet," he said. "And if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once." "And join in, I hope, sir," added the largest of the centaurs. "Of course," said Aslan. "And now, those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can. That is, the lions, centaurs, the unicorns, the horses, and the eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in front of us. to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of bustle and cheering they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? Us lions! That means him and me! Us lions!" That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me. At least he went on saying this until Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarfs, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a little bit. When all were ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them sorted into their proper order. They set out through a gap in the castle wall. At first, the lions and the dogs went nosing about in all directions, but then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a signal. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and the lions and the wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others were about half a mile behind them, and they were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then with the music of the hounds was mixed the roar of the lion, and sometimes the far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went, as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve, in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all these noises, another noise, a different one, which gave her a strange feeling inside. It was the noise of shouts and shrieks and the clashing of metal against metal. And then they came out of a narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund, all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowds of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in the daylight, they looked even stranger, and more evil and more deformed. Aslan's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield. So apparently the witch had been using her wand. Do you understand what that means? Statues, like she had gone and turned them all to stone, so they were all like sporadically around. But she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side the line stretched out, and horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. And then with a roar that shook all of Narnia from the western lamp-post to the shores of the eastern sea, the great lion flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted towards him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. The lion and the witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same moment all the warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed onto the enemy lines. Dwarfs with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed dozens. Unicorns with their horns, and centaurs with their swords and their hooves. And Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemies squealed and gibbered until the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. All right, last chapter in a bit.